Okay. Let me just switch it on for you. Okay. So I press it. You can so now it's on, and then it's Hey, I'm going to ask everyone to take a seat, and given just the layout of the room, I'm going to encourage you, if you're in that block, just at least for this next 45, 50 minutes or so, I'm going to suggest you might want to sit towards this side. Unfortunately, because of the bimmer, it's a little tricky to move things around, so I would encourage you to move across if you would like to. So this is now, I was thinking, we have now done a conversation together since that first High Holy Days that got interrupted by COVID. It was one of those things that we thought, how are we going to fill an afternoon when everyone is at home and we're trying to put things on for people to engage with? And we could very easily, via Zoom, have a conversation between Rabbi Blumberg and myself. And so it was a lovely thing that we could offer when we were digital and online. But we liked it, and we at least enjoyed the experience of talking to each other, and who doesn't like having an audience when you get to talk to each other? So it kind of stuck and has now become a fixture in our Yom Kippur afternoon program. And I will say that it is always such a joy and pleasure to have Rabbi Blumberg and to have Paula with him this afternoon, to have them in the community that is their home, that they were so integral to building generally, and to have the chance to have this conversation. I always think it's very interesting to hear from the intergenerational perspective. And for me, I think that often in our world, we do not spend enough time listening to voices of our seniors, and there seems to be, as we can see in discourse anyway, that there's a time where we tend to kind of focus in a different direction, and I think that's to our loss as a society and to our loss as a community. And so for us to have this opportunity to bring back our Rabbi Emeritus. Pardon? Yeah, you should tell your children that. That is very appropriate. I'll tell your children that for you if you want. So with that in mind, what we were thinking for this afternoon, we came up with a little bit of a heading, and then as has been our practice, we'll ask a couple of questions back and forth, and then at a certain point, we will throw it open to the community to also share in questions. Alison very kindly will be walking around with a microphone at that point to allow you to ask your questions.
Just before you get started, or as we get started, I just want to tell you that we're thinking of syndicating this. But more seriously, it is a delight to be here, to be with, I call him Rabbi Berkman, I don't know, to be with Danny and to experience the vibrancy of Shir Tikva. There's a new generation here, and they're building on, Danny is building on a foundation which many of us set, and it is heartwarming and inspiring. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Blumberg. So when we were coming up with what we wanted to talk about, this was the little brief that we gave ourselves. With news from Israel, rising levels of anti-Semitism, the divisiveness in politics, the climate crisis, fears for the future, we could go on. It would be understandable to throw up our hands in despair. And so we're going to reflect on some of the challenges we're facing, the Jewish responses, but also how one maintains hope against that backdrop. And of course, we will cover wide and a variety of subjects that we haven't even decided upon. But the question that I always like to ask Rabbi Blumberg first, and always going slightly off script with this one, but he will be preaching in Yizkor, but Yizkor is a very unique service in the liturgy, and I always like to ask him as a first question, if you were giving a High Holy Day sermon this year, what sermon would you have chosen to give, or what sermons would you have wanted to focus on for the community to hear about?
I forgot that you were going to ask me that. Over and above being delighted not to have to preach, I think I would probably give a sermon about Israel this year. What's happened is very troubling. Try to put it in the context of the other places in the world, including the United States, where democracy is being challenged, and try to focus on our need as Jews to support democratic government.
So we'll find a way to make sure that we get to hear that sermon at some point in the future. But in terms of the topic that we'd set ourselves, I think the first question just that came to my mind was just to reflect on what you're most worried about today. And when I started thinking about that for the question, I kind of started then going off, well, what are you most worried about for the world, or for the Jewish community, or for America, or for different generations? So you can take it in whatever direction you want to, but that question of what is it that you're most worried about today in general?
In the course of recent weeks, we have had numerous conversations with different people about what we would do, and this is going to be political, and some of you will immediately forgive me, but you know who I am. If Trump is elected again, and the discussions with my peers were, would we stay in this country? And the dilemma of not wanting to leave this country, but really being afraid of what will happen.
And with regards to that, that's in terms of concerns of, I assume that's to do with not just who's president, but also the divisiveness and the direction the country's going in with some of those things and such
the
like.
divisiveness is real, and the danger is real. The number of people with weapons in this country is beyond belief, and I just fear that there would be a lot of violence. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's among other things. And what happened to Jews in that environment is also scary.
I think one of the things that has been striking in the recent past has been things that were previously not said in public, that it would have been unacceptable. You couldn't walk around streets waving a swastika. You couldn't walk around streets making declarations, Jews will not replace us, things like that. That would have just been just beyond the pale. We now see them it taking place in American society, and with a longer view and a longer perspective, obviously, I wonder how you reflect to that, and how and what you think about that in terms of the direction that certain hates are now more publicly visible, at least, than they were maybe a generation ago.
There is no doubt that my generation has lived through a period of great acceptance in this country and a feeling of great security. I don't know if I ever talked about it publicly from the Bema, but I thought that anti-Semitism was I'm looking for a polite way to say this, that anti-Semitism, as heralded by certain national Jewish organizations, was overstated. Anti-Semitism was very low. Christian-Jewish relations were robust and growing. Relationships with the fundamentalist Christians and with the Catholic community was important. And Jews were very comfortable in this country. I think that that's not the case today.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting in terms of there's always been some concern and focus on anti-Semitism as a subject, as a topic. Right now, with the way that, with CJP's focus, with the Anti-Defamation League, with the American Jewish Committee, and the new foundation to combat anti-Semitism, it does feel that there is a waking up to a threat that wasn't at least perceived in quite the same way just 5-10 years ago.
Absolutely. When I worked with the American Jewish Committee, anti-Semitism wasn't on the agenda. All these very positive directions of interrelationship were. And it was ADL was continuing to talk about its role in combating anti-Semitism, and it was very good for fundraising. I was really pretty cynical about the ADL. It was very good for fundraising, but it wasn't real. I see today exactly the importance of ADL in our community.
And when reflecting on kind of the breadth of your experiences and the different periods, I wonder if there's a period either from recent history that can be informative for what we're encountering and experiencing now, or if you'd think of another period or just another time in Jewish history as a whole that might be informative for us for how we might think about responding to the current situation, especially with that being the direction that we went in to start off with.
Firstly, it's important that we feel that we are internally strong, that there's a reason to continue to be Jews and to be better Jews and to raise our children as Jews. And the stronger we feel internally, the easier it is to deal with difficult external threats. I think we have to look for our friends, and friends are always there. I guess I'm thinking of even during the worst time of the Holocaust, there were Jews who there were Christians who befriended Jews and saved and hid Jews and saved Jews, and that's really important. And I think that's what we have to foster. We have to not ghettoize ourselves, and certainly reach out for friends.
I do think that when reflecting on the challenges of the current moment and regards to rising levels of hate and what we're experiencing, I do think that we have, in contrast to maybe previous generations, I think the network of friends, allies, and support that is out there has been developed over several decades in a different way than it was previously. I think that it's worth noting that when things do happen, the Wayland Interfaith Leaders Association is one example. There will always be some communication from this Christian leader or that Muslim leader or this person or that person. And I think that when there have been issues that we've felt that we could reach out, and there's been what's been interesting, I think, has been the willingness to respond when we reach out. And I think that's maybe one of when we think about what gives us hope in the midst of this, I do think that the friendships that have been built between various religious communities and more widely in other spheres, I think, do mean that while we are potentially facing an anti-Semitism of a different magnitude and nature than we have previously, at least here in America, that there are reasons to feel that we are prepared to respond to it in a different way than maybe in the past.
I think I really do believe that's the case. My guess is if there was a significant incident of anti-Semitism here, our friends across the street would rally to be with us, as we have rallied to be with them.
And I think it goes. And I think one of the things is keeping in mind that both directions of friendship and making sure that while we are obviously very focused at this time on what the Jewish community is encountering, that not to ignore what other communities that may be also on the front lines of facing this rising levels of hate are experiencing, so that we can be there for them as well in the way that we might hope that they'll be there for us if and when needed.
That's really, I think, encouraging in the face of this being a scary time.
I want to ask you one other thing that you mentioned that we need to be strong about why we should be Jewish and positive about our Judaism. So it started on a bit of a down note with regards to the subject matter. A friend of mine who, one of the things that we rabbis do at this time, I don't know if retired rabbis have to do it in quite the same way, is but we're all talking about what are you preaching about? What's your sermon? And so I'm aware of several other subjects that are being covered in various other communities around the country and globally, actually. And one friend, to your comment about we should think about what we're proud to be Jewish for and what we want to share, his sermon is about what would be your Jewish elevator pitch. What would be the Jewish elevator pitch that you would give today to think really about what's the positives that you'd want to share in that moment, in that experience, rather than focusing on some of the negatives that people obviously are talking about. So as you'd mentioned that we should think about why be Jewish, the strength of being Jewish as positives, I wonder what might go into your Jewish elevator pitch that you would be giving to us who are gathered here, but also with an eye maybe towards the next generation in terms of what you'd want to share with them about why be Jewish as when we think about some of the things that suggest declining levels of religiosity and affiliation and all those other things that people write about and suggest.
Judaism gives us a home which is warm and secure and nourishing.
Okay.
Third floor.
It was a short elevator ride, not one of these skyscrapers. I think that's
That says it.
yeah. No, I think that's wonderful to hear. And with that in mind, what would you want us to be focusing on as individuals and as a synagogue community as we enter into a new year? We ask big questions for you if we're going to get an hour of your time, we're going to make sure we make the most of it for everyone gathered. But what would you want us to be focusing on as individuals and as a synagogue community?
But as a rabbi emeritus, I have no opinions about what's going on at your tikva today.
We'd value them if you'd like to share them, though.
I think I'll just extend the elevator pitch. I think we have to work very hard to help people see that this is a home for them, that their Jewish identity, whatever they started with, whatever, be it minuscule or traditional or cold reform or nothing, that there is that we all need a home where we can feel secure. We just can't be part of America. Nobody's just part of America. Everybody has their own subgroup. And Jews have a very rich persona, and to be part of that persona. Within that persona, I think opportunities to deal with the serious questions about meaning of life and how you create what kind of a world you want to create and how you make that a better community. Those are important things. And then on a personal level, I think that the search for meaning as individuals, it's called the parlance is spiritual search. The Musar movement is a really important part of that. That can make a difference for individuals, and that's what I would. That's what makes being a Jew valuable and worthwhile.
I think there's something that I reflect on in terms of, and you use the term of finding a home and that people should come to their home and the need for the home. One of the things that's been on my mind is kind of the need for community in general. That's one of the things that has really broken down, and the more that I reflect on society, what we're encountering, that breakdown of community, I think, contributes in a whole load of different directions. One of the breakdowns of community, I think, has also led to this kind of divisiveness that we're experiencing today in our society. Alison actually shared a really interesting article by David Brooks about where he talked about how America got mean. And it's an interesting article that I'm sure was making the rounds in sermons at various other synagogues in the country. But that sense of, I think he talked about the lack of moral education that comes from religious institutions and from religious affiliation. I also think there's a slightly broader thing of the lack of communal connection that leads to a lack of maybe moral education as well. I think there is a religious dimension to the moral education. I think there's also a communal dimension to that moral education. I think that that's something that is missing in our society when people are doing it on their own. And I don't think you get the same sense of moral connection or communal connection from tuning in just and watching things at a distance, or from kind of the do-it-yourself kind of concierge approaches to religion and other areas of life that people have. And I think, for me, that's one of the things that I'm concerned about, because I do think community is just, or a sense of home, I think it's the same thing, just different words,
Yes.
Is so important for people, and such a miss and a loss in our world today.
Particularly as there's this tremendous tendency to individualism, to isolate oneself.
Yeah, and I think that that's possibly, it's interesting to think about the way that the pendulum swings in different directions of where people gravitate towards, and there's definitely been that swing towards individualism, and I am curious as to whether the recent COVID experience and kind of the forced isolation that came with that will lead to a swing back to community in a different direction, that the pendulum swings back now with people looking for communal connection. I'm not sure that we're yet seeing it in enough areas of life, but I wonder if that might happen.
It occurred to me this morning, the numbers of people here, people are coming back to the synagogue, and the first service I know was very well attended, that people, that there is that tendency that people want to be part of a community again.
And I think against that backdrop, there are still, unfortunately, from my point of view, people not coming back as much as we'd like. We love seeing people in person. I think there's something that you can't get from the connection digitally. As someone who is a tech junkie in many ways, I still think there's a gap from that connection. And while the digital world is wonderful because it's allowed us to stay connected, I also think it's allowed us to become overly reliant on that type of connection, and we miss that face-to-face. And I think one of the things, I mean, we prioritize I think it's fair to, it's not a secret, but once every 4 to 6 weeks, we will meet in person as that face-to-face kind of opportunity. And I think there's something different from communicating via email, speaking on the phone, or even when we speak on Zoom, that is just different to...
You and I.
Yes, than sitting across the table from one another.
Sure. It escaped my mind what I wanted to say. I'll come back to it.
I think, I wonder if you'd want to say, in that search for meaning... do you want to...
I think we have to recognize that the electronic communication is going to remain part of us, and good things can happen. I am part of a group, and Paul is part of a separate group, and we're in a third group together, all of which are have intimate conversations that, and it's all electronic. It's all electronic, and it's just part of our life. You know? So I think, and study as well, and study opportunities. I study every week, Chavrusa style, and it's all online. It works.
So one more question, and then I think we'll open it up to allow people in the community to ask questions that are on their minds. But I was wondering about Tikva, hope. We're in Shir Tikva, in the Song of Hope synagogue, of just whether you'd want to say about either what gives you hope today, or how you maintain hope amidst all of the challenges, or what would be a message of hope that you would share with us as a community. Any direction you want to go about that subject.
Well, It's almost obvious we are a people of hope. We have a history which is with incredible numbers of difficult periods and periods of great enrichment and growth and education. And I think hope is built into us, and it's part of our liturgy. It's reflected again and again and again in the liturgy. And I think we just have to hold on to that as part of who we are. The only other thing I would say there is that no matter how difficult it is in the world, how impenetrable the problems are, there's always a way in which we can do something. See, I'm going to use a Yiddish term totally out of context, but it just occurred to me. There's always a knibble that you can grab onto. You know, knibbles are important because they grow. And be it you're concerned for Israel, you're concerned for the environment, you're concerned for anti-Semitism, every one of us should be able to find some way in which we can be engaged in a tikkun. And I think if we really believe that our singular effort can be multiplied again and again in community, that's the answer to all of the difficulties that we're experiencing today.
And I think that with those searching for those knibbles, I hope that's the correct term, and those acts of tikkun, those acts of repair that we can do, I think it is something that we can do individually, of course, but I think there's a power in the acts of tikkun that we can do communally, and we'll definitely be approaching some of those subjects that we've mentioned, things that are giving us concern, that we are thinking about what we can do in relation to them, be that in relation to our connection to Israel more broadly, in relation to anti-Semitism and various other subjects that are obviously front of mind at the moment today. With that, I think we're going to throw it open so if people have questions that they'd like to ask. So Alison's going to come with the microphone so that people can hear at home as well. And over to you, Jimmy.
As much as I love you, I have an issue. And the issue that I have is what's happened to families politically in this world today, in this country today. And you called Judaism as being home, but you started your conversation by taking a political bent of one side. What happens to family members that do not agree with you politically? And secondly, along that, is what is the responsibility of rabbis from the Bima to take or not take a political position?
There is not a political issue that doesn't have a core of morality behind it. And we are peddlers of morality. There is no simple, in our time, right and wrong. And I think that rabbis have to be very careful not to pontificate their concept of right based on New York Times or David Brooks or whatever. But I think our tradition gives us a fairly solid platform for for speaking about moral issues. And I think it's our responsibility to deal with it. How we, on a practical level, how I talk when I say something that I know is going to have a political tinge in front of Jimmy, and the minute I opened my mouth, I knew what was going to come, and it's okay. It's really important, number one, that we continue to talk. Number two, that we're friends, good friends, and that we respect differences. That's the only answer I can give you, Jimmy.
One of the, I don't know that this will happen, but I have a file for my sermons for future services, and for next year's High Holy Days, given that we'll be approaching an election, one of the things that I've been thinking about in the lead up to this one, but it felt more timely to wait for possibly next year. Whatever your opinions about AIPAC might be, positive or negative, that's not the subject. What struck me is that AIPAC can no longer gather together in the way that they once did. And one of the things that was striking about what AIPAC tried to do was that their gatherings, and I went to one in my first year here, was that it was across the political spectrum was their aim to do. And so that you had politicians from both sides speaking and sharing a message, and supporters of both sides gathered together in the hall. And for various reasons, AIPAC have made the decision that they can't do that anymore, it's just not possible to bring people together in that way. And I think that's a cause for concern in terms of how we relate to one another, that a group that sought to be kind of bringing together across the aisle, if you will, has kind of given up on doing across the aisle work and is pursuing a different way of approaching this issue and their subject specifically. But it does speak to that issue of how do we keep talking to each other? How do we maintain family, maintain a sense of home, friendship, et cetera, amidst disagreements and differences? And I think it's a shame that that's, whatever your opinion about AIPAC, I think it's a shame that that's the place that they feel is reflected in our political situation today. More a shame that that's our political situation, but that's where they feel they're at. So, okay.
So you started talking in the beginning of the conversation about both Israel and about anti-Semitism. And one of the problems that we have right now with anti-Semitism is that it's coming from both sides. You know, we have the extreme right, which hates everybody that isn't white and American, and we have the left, which seeks to tar Israel with a brush that is connected with every other single thing and undermine the legitimacy of Israel as a sovereign nation and use that as an excuse for anti-Semitism. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people spout anti-Semitism and then use their hatred of Israel as a justification for it, which of course is very, very disturbing for us as Jews. So while I'm heartened by what you say about friendships we have with the people across the street and connections we have in the community and so on, I really feel that it's time for rabbis of any congregation, as liberal as we are, and I say this as a lifelong liberal Jewish lefty, or any other kind of Jewish congregation, to stand up and speak unequivocally about anti-Semitism and about the creep of liberalism into anti-Semitism. And I'll give you an example. There was this disgusting map produced by BDS recently about the map on the web of slavery, which named several rabbis as part of this intersectional responsibility for slavery. And I waited in vain for a completely strong statement condemning this from CJP or whatever. It never came. If we don't speak up, who is going to speak for us? If we don't stand up and stick our heads above the parapet and say, this has to stop now, and we condemn this, who is going to do that? I've read many articles suggesting that the way Nazism took hold in Germany and the way poisons like this take hold everywhere is that you start with something small. and nobody says something, and then you think you can get away with something bigger. Please tell me when we are going to stand up against the anti-Semitism from both sides, and as liberals, not be afraid of saying that just because we support other liberal causes.
So I think that from the BIMA, at least over the last few years, I do think we've tried to call out the anti-Semitism that we experience on both sides, and I think that that's one of those things that you kind of go far enough around and then they meet up again, and where do they meet up again? With their hatred of Jews, unfortunately. And I think that that's one of the things we've talked about, is that neither extreme is good for the Jews. I think it's fair to say that the center is generally the best for the Jewish community, whatever that looks like, but that's generally where Judaism has thrived, when the extreme voices of left or right are not allowed to flourish. And I think we are in a worrying situation where the voices of the extreme right are emboldened to speak out on various issues, and the voices of the extreme left are emboldened to speak out on various issues. And I think that we have to think through, number one, I think it is important that we call out those actions when we see them, and I think we have to be very clear that just because, and I think it's to that, the comment that was made earlier as well, in any direction, we might disagree on one or two issues, we might agree on other issues, and we can own the agreement and the disagreement, but we have to be unequivocal in the disagreement when it comes to subjects such as anti-Semitism. And one of the things that I think we have to do is I think we have to be involved in helping to educate others about what is anti-Semitic. That sometimes there is a blind spot, and various books, Dara Horn's book, I can't remember the title, about dead Jews, I can't remember the exact title, and David Baddiel's book about Jews Don't Count, both of them talk about the fact that there's a blind spot when it comes to Jews, and I think that that's one of the challenges that we're encountering, because we're not holistically a visible minority in some ways. Some are, some aren't, and there's look Jewish, not look Jewish, all those kind of things that come up, and so we kind of get ignored in the kind of hates in some way, and not treated in the same way. And I think it's something that we have to do a better job of standing up to it and speaking out. And I will say that, not that I am not a CJP spokesman, I'm not paid for by CJP or in any way represent them in that respect, but they are prioritizing anti-Semitism as combating anti-Semitism as one of their 4 core areas of work for the forthcoming year. What that will lead to, I don't know, because again, that's not, I'm not in those conversations to that extent, but it is something that they are seeking to prioritize. And we do have in the Boston area, the foundation, I can't remember the exact name of it, but that Robert Kraft set up to combat anti-Semitism as well. So it's definitely something that's on the agenda, and I think those groups are aware of needing to combat extreme voices on both sides, but I think you're right that we have to speak out and do what we can to make sure that people are aware that this is a problem and something that needs to be tackled and challenged.
I really appreciate what you're saying about finding allies, finding friends, and making those connections. I'm wondering, though, what else actively can we be doing and can we be getting the next generation? You know, my son will be mitzvah in a month. You know, so that's what I'm thinking right now. But what can we be actively doing to make things better? And I know that's a very broad question, but you know, that's kind of where my mind is right now.
I will say that whenever I get asked that question about what does give me hope and why to have hope, I do think that the teenagers and the way that they respond to various challenges and just that next generation, they are speaking out, they are lobbying, they are active about the causes that they care about in such an amazing way that it's just inspiring. And the changes that they have made in a variety of areas, not necessarily specifically around anti-Semitism, but they've recognized that they have power, and they've recognized how to harness their power in speaking up and speaking out. Cantor and I were talking about just that recent change in sexual education that's just taken place in Massachusetts, that was part of a campaign that started from teenagers who didn't feel that they were being taught in the right way, and that led to legislation at the state level, and now the way that they're going to be taught has shifted. And so the teens definitely inspire me with the way that they will speak up and speak out on the causes that they believe in. I think we have a responsibility to engage with this work. And so as an example with JFS, who are close allies, Jewish Family Service of Metro West, we're going to be offering active bystander training to our teens on a Wednesday in October, where JFS will come and do that training. That's not stand up to anti-Semitism training, it's bystander training. So it's how do you spot all the hates in that way so that we can start to give them the language, and hopefully that then spreads to them talking about it, raising it, and raising an awareness in that way. But I think we need to call out acts of hate against all groups and then give people the sense of power to do that. And again, I do think that we can see the teenagers leading the way in that in some respects.
But your question was, I think, broader, was it not?
Yeah.
Your question was broader, or at least I heard it broader. And my answer to that is what can we do? What can you do? Something. Whatever it is. I mean, you know, there's no singular formula, and and unless you have power leading a company with significant resources, you know, find something. Each of us should find something, if for no other reason that our children and our grandchildren will see that we're doing something.
So this anti-Semitism talk is actually pretty relevant to my job right now, and I love.
I can't hear you.
Sorry. So the anti-Semitism talk is kind of relevant to my job right now, and while I appreciate that we're talking about these broad things, I work with pretty psychotic patients, and so sometimes they'll say pretty anti-Semitic things, and it is not necessarily beneficial to the patient to educate them or to confront it or fix it. And so I'm kind of left with carrying the mental burden of hearing pretty anti-Semitic things and knowing that, like, it's my role to go, okay, but how can I help this patient instead of, like, education or fixing it. I've tried education. Sometimes it doesn't work. So I'm guessing, do you have any advice for when you're dealing with kind of daily anti-Semitic things? Not like political, just like, how do you carry that burden?
So the question was about the burden of carrying daily anti-Semitic experiences in that way, and how to respond or handle that, or just any tools. I mean, I think that this is one of those times where I think community is really important in that regard. That knowing that there is a place to turn where people will understand what you're experiencing, will listen, validate, and be supportive. I think that's really important. And I think how we support one another in these experiences, I think, is really vitally important. And I think that's part of it, also encouraging people to speak up about it. That I will say that as rabbi, that we hear about some incidences that take place, and some people will kind of reach out to us to let us know so that we can then respond in some way. But I'm sure we hear about a fraction of what's actually going on out there. And I think that the more that we're aware of it, the more that both we can offer support and that we can refer on to the relevant people. That I will say that when there were incidences locally, I call JCRC, ADL, and AJC almost straight away. That's the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Committee, to see what they're doing or how we should respond. And it's good to know that we have those groups out there who can be supportive. So I think speak up about it and look for the support, and we can hopefully offer some of that.
I would just add, if any of us or any of our children or grandchildren are experiencing anti-Semitism, being bullied because they're Jews, and they don't, firstly, they shouldn't try to handle it alone. They should reach out to people who can help them figure it out. What's the right response? And they should not feel that they are alone.
So you've touched upon it briefly in your opening remarks about the difficulties happening in Israel right now. So in regard to Israel, I guess my question is, where is there hope for there? Because it frightens me too to see such awful, diverse, difficult things happening there. Where is there hope there? I mean, where are we going to go? What are we going to do?
One answer is just the statistic that I think for 30 weeks, every Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, there's a demonstration against the excesses of the government. And that's extraordinary. And it just goes, pardon me? Up to 35, they go right down. Okay, there we go. And that says something about the strength of the country. I think that's really important.
That's only one side. That's the group of people who are protesting against what's happening. How do we reach out to the other side to hopefully? How do we reach out to the other side to hopefully bring something together? Sure, there's hope that there's going to be people who are fighting for democracy, but there are people on the other side who feel as strongly as they do about what they want. How can that be bridged?
I think I have to say I absolutely do not know. You know, I mean, I just don't know. And it's an honest statement, and I have no way of dealing with it. You know, I mean, firstly, we're American. I'm an American Jew. I'm distant from it. If I were more mobile and at a different life stage, perhaps, I would have gone to some of the demonstrations that took place here, but they're supporting what is, I think, the majority. This is tough. It's tough. I think, Allison, there are other questions. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh dear, I'll try to stay calm. My wife and I made Aliyah to Israel 10 years ago. We live in Rehavia in Jerusalem. We're here visiting our children, otherwise we wouldn't be here. What's going on in Israel is much more complex, much more historical than perhaps is related in the American media. And I'm speaking as an Ashkenazi Jew. For the last 150 years, the Ashkenazi elite who have controlled first the old Yishuv in pre-state Israel, and who still to a great extent control Israel now, have repressed and oppressed the Mizrahi majority. More than 60% of the Jews in Israel come from Arab countries. The Jews who established the state, got a hold of the economy and the political structure, are Ashkenazi Jews. And they have mightily repressed the Mizrahim. When, just after 48, when between 48 and 1960, essentially 1 million Arab Jews were pushed out of 22 Arab nations and came to Israel. They were literally sent to development areas, while the Ashkenazi Jews lived between Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. The Mizrahim were sent to places like Beersheba or Carmiel in the north, or Metula right on the Lebanese border. and it is the Mizrahim who suffered the most from Arab terrorism since the founding of the state. And they have been kept in having much less political power than the Ashkenazi, to the extent that in the 1980s there was a movement a movement among the Mizrahim to join with Israeli Arabs to form a single political party to fight the Ashkenazim. That didn't work out. But what is going on now is basically, in my view, an uprising of the Mizrahim against the Ashkenazi power structure. With regards to the Israeli Supreme Court, from what I've read, there have been 79 justices on the Israeli Supreme Court over the years. Only 6 of them have been Mizrahim. And what the ultra-Orthodox and Mizrahi Alliance are seeking to do now is to change how judges are chosen. They have been chosen in the past via a small committee that basically made the Israeli Supreme Court a good old boy network of Ashkenazim. Also, the Israeli Supreme Court, with regard to what is in the press called the reasonableness clause, that the Supreme Court can overturn anything the Knesset does if they feel it's unreasonable. And just
So
as
I do
nebulous
want
as
to,
that.
I appreciate that. I think it's important.
I could go on for an hour.
Yeah, no, I think that, so I appreciate the perspective, and I think it's worth noting, look, I think that with regards to the question about what gives hope, and Rabbi Blumberg's response that at the moment very little in regard to Israel, I do think that I would offer a slightly different take, potentially, but I think that what has been interesting is to see the awakening on both sides of what they believe in and what they want Israel to be. And I think this is a moment of existential threat to the country in terms of what it's going to look like. But at the same time, there's been a re-engagement with what does it mean to be a Zionist? What does Israel look like? What's the future going to be? And actually, it's interesting to note that when we look at the history of America, that it was around this time, approximately 70 or so years in, that in American history, the Civil War takes place. And so it's not so strange that you have this experiment with what the nation's going to look like, and 70 or so years in, there's a breakdown in what it looks like. And here, they found a way to kind of get past that and continue forward. We're all here as a result of that. That's the continuation of the story. And so the hope is that Israel can also continue in that way. I do think, the one thing that I will say, I do think it's important to acknowledge whatever one's opinions about the judicial reform, and some know my opinions, but it's not relevant for this moment. I think that some of the excesses of the parties that are represented in the current government are, of course, for concern for many of us with the values that we hold in terms of the Israel that we would like to see. And I think this probably is the most extreme government one is going to witness, and I think there will be some kind of pendulum swing, again, back in terms of what alliances will look like. This is not necessarily a natural alliance in the way that it's being presented, but it's come together for a variety of reasons. And again, how far they get, whether the president is able to kind of bridge a compromise, one doesn't know, but there's other thoughts and perspectives. I think Nick's at the back, and Nick was waiting. Yeah, I think we can have take two.
On this question of politics and polarization, there's a lot of what's called nut picking that goes on both sides. You find the craziest person on the other side and say their position represents the whole position. But there's also a lot of room for you to say, well, you know, on the other hand, there's a whole different viewpoint about this topic. My question is, what do you feel is a rabbi's duty to help people see both sides of an issue?
I think that it's very important. That we do have a responsibility. Again, there's a difference between the political and the moral dimensions of any issue. And I don't think we should see ourselves as the arbiter of the political, although we have to be very careful in in our public presentation and our teaching to be balanced. We have a responsibility to do that. Again, always on the moral core.
I think that
And we have not. I have not done that enough in my rabbinate.
I think that we are living through a particularly divisive time in politics where people are divided and I think separated in a different way than maybe 20 years ago, just in terms of the kind of sense of feeling of those divisions. And I think one of the things that we try to do is we try to build a community where everyone feels welcomed and that everyone feels they can belong, but that doesn't mean that every opinion is welcome in that community. And I think there are certain perspectives that will ultimately fall outside of the communal connection. I think that they're on a variety of issues, and we hope to be broad enough that people can feel that they belong, but I think that ultimately on certain subjects that do feel core to our understanding of who we are as Jews, our moral values and certain obligations that we have, we're going to stand firm by them. Someone espousing hate in this context against another group, they might come to it from whatever perspective. That's further than we would think that we're trying to build a kind of house for all in that way. There was one more, and I think then we should probably wrap it up.
Still time? Okay. Rabbi Blumberg, you said something which I thought was very interesting about your experience, your generation's experience in feeling accepted and safe as Jews in America. And that struck me because of something Rabbi Berkman said this morning about this sort of illusory idea of, reaching happiness or reaching a certain state that we want. And I wonder, as you look back and look forward, Rabbi Blumberg, I think your generation, I think of that as not something that happened to you, right? It was that something that your generation played a big role in, but it also took place in a time of other great fractures. I mean, my father, whom you know, when he went down to Mississippi in 1962 to teach math, most of the people he knew were Jews from the Northeast. And, so how do you think about, if it isn't a state that was achieved, quote, acceptance, right, but something that improved, how do you think about what you were able to do to positively affect that and how that could be looked forward for my kids and their generation?
I'm not sure how to answer your question, Nick. A large part of my rabbinate was outer directed to the African American community and into the Christian community. And I have no way of measuring what my success. I can only tell you that I entered into relationships and I tried hard. That's about the only answer that I can give. I'm glad I did what I did, and I would do it again. That's the best answer I can give.
So unfortunately, we have been beaten by the clock once again and come to the end of our time. I want to just say a tremendous thank you to Rabbi Blumberg. As Rabbi Emeritus, he is and a retired rabbi in that way, he's under no obligation to have to work, so to speak, on the high holy days, but yet every year, very generously, he gives of his time. And to make sure that you all stay for the continuing services, he's going to be preaching in Years Course, so I hope you'll be staying to hear him preach in our Years Course services. And I just want to say, just in the midst of this community, just how grateful I am to have you as my teacher, as my friend, as my mentor, as someone that I get to engage with. And one of the gifts of Shir Tikva has definitely been you in that relationship. Well, and so I'm delighted to get to share this moment with you and to share on an annual basis our conversations.
Yes, thank you, Danny. I just want to say that Shir Tikva, for Paula and for me, Shir Tikva is our home. We kind of wander a little bit in terms of synagogues, a lot of it electronically, And we come back here because it's our home. And it's also, we feel like grandparents here because Shepping Nachas at the strength of congregation and community that you're building.
Blumberg for joining us. And again, we will be beginning our next service in about 15 minutes or so, give or take. So please do make yourself comfortable. If you're not in the chair you like because we were skewed to the left, please do move to whichever chair you'd like to be in, whatever side of the building. And we'll be beginning shortly. And again, do stay for Yizkor to hear Rabbi Blumberg.